Dan's travels as a journalist and novelist have taken him to 30 countries and 3 war zones. His book, Lie in the Dark, won the Crime Writers Association of Britain's John Creasy Memorial Dagger Award for Best First Crime Novel. The Small Boat of Great Sorrows, won their Ian Fleming Steel Dagger Award for Best Thriller, and The Prisoner of Guantanamo won the Dashiell Hammett Award from the International Association of Crime Writers. Safe Houses is Dan's 11th novel. He worked closely with people from the intelligence community to make this novel accurate and authentic, and from my standpoint, it is both. Dan is joined this evening by 2 of his sources. He will introduce them momentarily. I won't get too far ahead, but it's Karen and Francine. It's a pleasure meeting you as well. But I'm going to let Dan do the introductions. Last point, I did jot down a note, also is not customary for me, but I jotted down a note that the title in the exploration of safe houses, it's really an exploration of what makes a safe house safe. And I had permission to make a comment about that. So I don't want to spoil the book, but I think you'll be treated and reflect on that when you're done reading the book, and hopefully it was accurate. But enjoy the book, enjoy tonight's program. I'll turn it over to Dan.
Thank you, Chris, and thank you to Francine and Karen for agreeing to sit on the panel with me. And in fact, I'm sort of the square peg in the round hole here. I did a lot of research about women in the CIA, and they've both actually lived that. I'll start with Francine, was an analyst, intelligence analyst in the CIA for 4 years. And she grew up mostly in this area, or at least went to high school in this area, Georgetown, Visitation, and then master's degree from Princeton, undergraduate degree from Princeton, master's degree in history from Stanford, and you'll hear more Ivy League when we get over here. I was a state school person from North Carolina, but I'll try not to feel intimidated here. So, among her intelligence work that she did, she was involved in, I believe, counterterrorism for a while, and that involved the investigation of the Pan Am 103 bombing over Lockerbie, Scotland. And she has since written 27 novels. You can find a couple of them down there at the table. About 6 of them are spy novels. She's done detective series, and as befits someone who worked in the CIA, she also writes under a cryptonym at times, or as we call it, a pen name. And her latest novel is that Murder in Nantucket, correct? Or Death in Nantucket. Death in Nantucket.
Yeah.
And so lots of good books to choose from Francine. And I forget, where are you now living?
I live in Denver, Colorado.
Right.
I've only been back in D.C. for a couple hours.
Yeah, okay. Well, thanks for coming all this way.
My pleasure.
Karen Cleveland grew up in the St. Pete area in Florida. I'm trying to remember all of her academic credentials. She's got master's degrees from Trinity College, Dublin, and from Harvard University, that one in public policy. She was with the CIA 8 years as an intelligence analyst, specializing in, as you would guess from reading her wonderful spy novel, Need to Know. She specialized in Russia and also for a while in counterintelligence, and both those threads come into her book. And she's now working on her next novel, having gotten into this racket full time with its arts of deception and making things up and whatnot. So I would like to comment briefly on how I ended up on a panel, and because of what's in Safe Houses, where we're going to be discussing the role of women in the CIA and how it has evolved and the state that it's reached today, and whether they've cleared all of the hurdles that used to be put before them or in the earliest days as it was coming out of the Second World War and morphing from the OSS into the CIA. My book was set in 1979, and for research, I emailed people like Francine to get their insights on when she was there. I talked to some other people. I had done some old interviews that I looked up the notes for a previous project, such as Betty McIntosh, who was a veteran not only of the CIA, but of the OSS. And one thing stood out and struck me when I was looking at those old notes, and it was that Betty McIntosh had been out in the field in Asia doing some pretty interesting work during the Second World War for the OSS. When she got back from the war, the OSS was dissolved and things were in flux, and she got another job and went back to school. And not until 1959, 1960 did she go back to work for the CIA, and Alan Dulles hired her. And she went to work in Langley. And in that period, she discovered something kind of odd, because during the war, her work had been accepted at face value. And people took her on her own terms, and they thought, you're doing important work, why wouldn't we? She found that when she got to Langley in 1960, that she was treated by most men there, even though she had this pretty distinguished past with the OSS, she was treated as a glorified clerical worker or secretary, and she found that the attitude was somewhat dismissive. And I think it was partly the attitude of the times, and partly that whole coming out of the war attitude when sort of Rosie Riveter had done important work, but all these men came back and said, okay, we'll take over now. And I think that kind of took place in intelligence work as well. The men thought, well, yeah, we needed you then, but now, you know, let the boys do it again. So I dealt with some of this in 1979, and the single most important piece of research I found was I brought this transcript, a 23-page transcript of a CIA declassified document about a panel discussion, another one among 4 women who'd worked for the CIA. 2 of them had come aboard in the 1970s. And I will just read you briefly one thing, and then I'll get going with some questions, and we'll start off the discussion. Because this was an item from this that I shamelessly milked for the book. I applied it to one of my main 2 women characters. And it was a bit of shock therapy, and it was the way she got a job into the field. And the name of this woman was, her name was Meredith. The last name was redacted, even though this was a fairly innocent discussion. And she said she went over as a contract wife. And in those days, you could marry, if you were married to a male operations officer, they might let you go to the same station where they were going. And she was hoping to be in operations herself in 1981. And she went out with the deputy chief of Europe, and he said to me, I really don't believe in women being ops officers. And I said, I don't understand. Why is that? And he said, well, because, you know, they'll have families. And I said, you know, almost all of your male ops officers have families too. No, he said, you might get pregnant. First of all, you can't be an ops officer while you're pregnant. And secondly, you'll have to take all that time off. And I had 2 children at the time, and I said, well, it's okay because I've been fixed. And immediately he said, well, okay, you seem like a reasonable candidate. We'll put you in for that. Well, I set up a little scene much like that, except I embellished it a bit and had my character, who was still single, say, even though she was still single, say, oh, it's okay, I've been fixed. And the chief of station says, fixed? And she says, yeah, you know, like a dog or cat. So that's the extremes that some women would go to at that point, to lie about their medical history so they could slip by those last hurdles and get into the field. I'd like to start with some questions. I'd like to ask both of you this and start with Francine. And Francine, when you gave me that very generous email answering all of my often ignorant questions about it, one thing that jumped out at me and I thought was interesting, you talked about the empowering effect of going through the training in paramilitary and spycraft that everyone was going through, and it sort of, it made you, well, you said it was empowering, and I would like you address that, and then you could also talk
actually not everyone was going through it, which I think is part of what was fascinating. The career training program is required for people who are going to be case officers, which is what the agency refers to CIA agents as in popular parlance. And so all case officers have to do the career trainee year, but they then cull candidates from what were then, at my period of time, the other 3 directorates, which were administrative, intel, and science and technology, to go through the same program. And it's something that I had no idea I was going to be funneled into. I had gotten out of graduate school and come here with my husband, who's a lawyer, and fully intended to work in McLean simply as an analyst, and instead was diverted for a year of training. And it was paramilitary training, 6 weeks at the farm, which is the CIA's training ground outside of Williamsburg. And it was also a period of tradecraft training, which is sort of the basics in surveillance and dead drops and agent handling. And in my group of trainees, perhaps 1/10 were women. And we were given to a guy who was a former Army Ranger. He was 126 pounds of pure Texan grit. His name was Jack. He was a tough bastard, and so we named our particular bunkhouse Club Jack, as though it were Club Med. And we decided we were going to live up to him, because we had said to him, "Why are you training us, these 9 women?" And he said, "Because I wouldn't give my man a job I wasn't prepared to do myself." Apparently training women was considered that lowbrow among the trainers. But what happened to us, I think, is that we became very much adrenaline junkies, because every single day we were asked to do something that was way outside our comfort zone. We would all get up an hour earlier than the men because we were blow drying our hair. I had a particular shade of MAC lipstick. I'm a lipstick person, and it was MAC's Chili, which went really well with camouflage, and I carried it in the iodine pocket of my Army belt instead of iodine tablets for purifying water. And, it was just a constant tension between those impulses, doing our hair, making sure we looked okay, and the impulse to, when we were appointed to lead the morning march, never to fall behind the rest of the marchers, but to be way out in front of them, because by God, we had to prove ourselves. And I had grown up, visitation. I'd grown up pre-Title IX. I'm old enough that Title IX came in when I was in college. So I'd grown up really without the kind of equalizing influence of sports in my early education. And being forced through boot camp was something that tested me every single day. But as each day passed and I felt that I had acquitted myself, it was heady. It made me feel like I had possibilities I had never tapped.
Karen, could you talk about how you ended up at the CIA and where you ended up? When you first got there, I'd also like to know, what did you see as sort of the horizon that, your opportunities and whatnot?
Yeah, sure. So I was at the agency from 2008 to 2016. I joined, basically I saw it as a way to sort of make a difference. It was sort of an idealistic thing. I had a 9/11 happened when I was in college, and then a friend of mine was killed in Iraq a couple of years later. So I saw it as sort of my way to kind of do something for my country. And, I guess coming in, I had a little bit of a different sort of training experience. My firsthand experience was in the Directorate of Intelligence, so it was on the analytics side of things. So my training wasn't quite as strenuous as what you went through, and I guess I encountered more equality, I guess. So I think there have been a lot of strides made in those years, and certainly on the analytics side of things. And I think I can't really speak to sort of the operations side of things as much, but yeah, so that's sort of how I ended up there.
Did either of you seek out any old veterans, female veterans, and if so, did those conversations ever go back to, did they ever talk about, well, how good you have it now, or as compared to how she'd had it earlier, or did that ever come up in those?
I think, I don't think I did, and my experience there, I worked with as many women as men. I had as many female supervisors as I did male supervisors in the 8 years I was there. And I don't think that was everyone's experience, but that was my experience. And so sort of being a woman was not as much of an issue for me personally in the years that I was there. So.
What about?
Well, I think that's partly true of the differences between analysis and ops. And I was not in ops. I was destined for analysis after my year of training. So I feel like I can absolutely agree with you about that sense of equality in analysis. Something that I thought was significant when I was there is that it was the opening of the daycare center at the CIA, and it was the first government agency to have a daycare center. And Barbara Bush opened it, and it was because so many people who worked there looked like Karen and me. And so I routinely would have office mates who would go breastfeed their children on their lunch hours. And at one point in analysis, my entire chain of command was female, except for the director of intelligence. So it is a heavily female place, and I think that's partly because it's a great second career for a married couple with 2 careers, in the sense that you do not have to take your work home. You aren't allowed to take your work home. So when you leave the building, you leave your work behind. And as a working mother, that can be a really nice boundary to have in a 2-career family. That's just my thought. However, I do recall when I was training, half the women in my training group were in ops, destined for ops. And one was the daughter of a career case officer. She had been lifted off of several embassy roofs by helicopters in hot spots around the world. She'd grown up in the agency. She'd grown up as an intern in the summers. And at 22, she was in training as a DO case officer. And she and I were out doing a land navigation one night where we had to find our way at night across a piece of terrain together as partners. And she just started talking, and she said, I don't see any role models ahead of me. When I look at the DO, and this is, of course, several decades before you were there, I don't see a woman I want to be, or I think I can be. And I realized what she was saying is there weren't mentors necessarily. And I think perhaps that was because a lot of them were in the field and she was at headquarters. So I think where the difference in gender did play out was in management. That for young hirees, there were not female managers necessarily in different divisions of the agency that they could point to as role models and mentors and feel a sense of hierarchical support. And I'm sure that has evolved. But I know that my immediate manager at one point in my life was constantly attending glass ceiling meetings. So it was on the radar, but it became a bureaucratic problem rather than a...
Yeah. It's interesting you would say that about no role models, and I guess because they all were out in the field, but I was wondering too if I guess with some older men, it's harder for them to get used to the idea of women in operations. And I've always wondered if the people who outed Valerie Plame would have done so casually and routinely had that been a male operative. And
No.
yeah. And why do you, that because it is a more dismissive attitude, is particularly that generation, or?
I mean, I hate to respond off the cuff because I haven't seriously contemplated this answer. Yeah. But I have a feeling they thought she'd sit down and take it.
Right.
That she'd be cowed.
So when I knew I was coming onto this panel, and I tried to sort of think about sort of what my experiences were as a woman, because it honestly had been sort of a non-issue for me, and it wasn't something that I had really started thinking a lot about until I left the CIA and kind of started this career as a writer, and people started asking me about it. And one example really stands out in my mind. It was when it was early in my career, so I was kind of in my late 20s, and I was taking part in a course that was open to people from throughout the different parts of the government. And so it was a room full of people, and the vast majority were men, and the vast majority were sort of had a couple of decades on me. They were 40s or 50s, and so I felt a little bit out of place there. But I think that does say something about the agency and how the CIA has evolved, that, you know, I was given that opportunity to attend. And, you know, a lot of other parts of the government, it was, you know, a very different demographic that was there. But I was making kind of small talk with the man sitting next to me, and I said I was from CIA, and he said, "Oh, are you a secretary?" And that was the first time in my career at the CIA where I sort of felt like somebody was looking at me as, you know, a woman and therefore inferior, rather than just, you know, a professional and somebody who's competent. So that was kind of an interesting experience.
How old do you think that male was?
It was probably 50s or so,
Yeah.
but you know, it was different. That was not something that I had
Yeah.
encountered at the CIA.
Well, in fact, something interesting you said in your email to me. You said that the one time you had someone try to sabotage your career, it was another woman who found you threatening.
She may have found me threatening. She may have just disliked me. But yeah, she definitely set out to, I think, encourage me to resign by undermining my confidence.
Yeah.
And interestingly, it was her superior, who was also a woman, who rectified the situation.
Mm-hmm.
And I found that to be two different approaches to something that Madeleine Albright touched on, and which set off a firestorm during the last election, that there was a special place in hell for women who undermine other women. And I think there is a generational change in that attitude, or could be. I'm hoping that is true. I think the initial group of women who broke into what was viewed as a male-dominated world were very protective of their own status, and they saw younger women coming up with perhaps greater ease as somehow threatening. And so,
Because the slots had always been more limited for them,
Right.
I guess.
I
So
think that could be
they saw
true.
it as a smaller window, I guess,
Yeah.
of opportunity.
and interestingly, what the older woman did was transfer my immediate supervisor and then assign me a mentor within the agency who was a woman, and instructed me to go have lunch. And I went and had lunch with this particular woman every few weeks, and she was phenomenal, and she gave me the sort of confidence to proceed, which was really critical at that time. And I've always been immensely grateful for that, because it was an instance of a manager who was female recognizing a lack and a need and how to fill it, without simply reacting out of, I don't know, punitive impulses, you know. So
Now, Karen, without sounding like the mossback in here who says, "Oh, you can't do that job because you'll have babies," your character in Need to Know feels a lot of pressure and a lot ambivalence at times in her job as an analyst in the Russia department, basically, because she's having children. And I think I was wondering how you were talking about. I think that you come by that personally. You were saying.
Yeah, I mean, I think anytime you're kind of balancing young kids and a career, it's difficult, and I think it's difficult sort of in any career. Yeah, and you know, that's something that in Need to Know, the character does kind of struggle with that, and you know, I think I spent a long time working in counterterrorism, and that's kind of one of those areas where you sort of do have to give 100%. Like there's no way that you can kind of live with yourself if you're not giving 100% to your job. And I think you know, there is sort of, you do kind of have to, something's got to give at some point, and that is a difficult position to be in. And I think nobody who works at the CIA loses sight of kind of the responsibility that you have that comes along with the job. And you know, that said, I worked with so many people who had families at home and who had kids, and you know, I don't think it really did slow people down. You know, so many people were out there kind of taking advantage of all the opportunities that there are and traveling, and so yeah, I was impressed when I was there with how people were managing to balance it.
Given your background in Russia, I can't let the opportunity of having you as a captive panelist go without asking if you can offer us anything that we haven't heard about the Steele dossier. So.
No comment on that.
We can talk later. So no. Okay. I would like to open this up to some questions from you guys, whether it's about our books or about their careers or about research that I would have done to try to get some insights on all this. And go ahead.
Okay. One thing I wondered about, I know if you write a nonfiction, have worked for the agency and write nonfiction, it has to get reviewed and can be read penciled. What are the guidelines for fictional work?
Yeah, it's the same. There's a publications review board, and anything fiction or nonfiction, if you've worked at the CIA, you have to get everything you write approved by the board.
Sources and methods. That's
yeah, to make sure that there's nothing classified inadvertently in your work.
But I have to say, there's a huge leeway with fiction. My first spy novel was called The Cutout, and it came out in January of 2001. And it was the first time I'd had to submit a book for review because it dealt with the agency. It was probably my 10th book. And I just avoided the whole necessity by not writing espionage before that. They asked me to only change one word. And it was the CIA's internal acronym for itself in cable traffic. That was fine. My second book, nothing. And then the third book I wrote about a loosely veiled story about Jim Thompson, who was a Southeast Asian silk trader, but really a knock, a non-official cover CIA agent. And he disappeared without a trace in 1967. And so I submitted that book, and they said, the guy who was accepting it said, "Oh my God, did you figure out who killed him?"
I'll just add that I did a long research interview with William Hood once, who was number 2 to Jim Angleton for a while. And he'd written a wonderful nonfiction account called Mole about how they ran a Russian out of Vienna. And he said that was scrutinized no end, redacted heavily. And then he wrote a novel, several novels actually, 3 spy novels. And he said they hardly ever touched those. And he said it was always more fun to write those because he could get into much greater operational detail about stuff he'd actually been involved with. He would just change the names to protect the innocent, as they used to say, and the places and whatnot.
Well, you know, there's an actual point to that. And this is, I was in the counterterrorism center at the time that Tom Clancy came through because they were filming Clear and Present Danger. And he was allowed to tour the counterterrorism center. We all had to clear our desks off, but he just wanted to see it for visuals. And then he had a meeting with the head of the CTC at the time and was probably not told much. But the guy walked out afterwards, after Clancy had left, and he said, "This is fabulous. He's going to have a spy satellite that can read license plates." He said, "You know, we can't do that. But nobody in the world knows it, and now everyone in the world is going to think we can." And so to him, this was the best propaganda vehicle imaginable. He had terrorists worldwide thinking that our spy satellites could read license plates. So, you know, fiction is actually an arm of government sometimes in the least obvious way.
Yeah. You had a question up here, and she'll bring you the microphone.
Thank you. I'm not quite sure how to phrase this. I'm wondering, with all the training you go through, why would you then leave after a few years? 4 doesn't seem like very much. 8 seems like more. But I'm wondering, on average, is there a difference between men and women as to how long they tend to stay? Is there really not much difference? And why would you want to leave?
I had written my first novel in the hours after work, and my husband, the lawyer, wanted to move to Colorado. And I sold my book, and I had a contract for 2 novels, and I could live in Colorado and write. It was also during the initial years of the Clinton downsizing. So a lot of people were leaving in that particular year. And I really had a vision of my life that was more on my own terms. I love working for myself. So those were my personal motivations.
Yeah, I mean, I was there 8 years, and writing was something I wanted to do, and I was ready for a change. And, you know, I think there are a lot of people who spend their entire careers there, and there are people who leave after a bit and decide to pursue other careers. So I think, I don't know that I've noticed a difference between kind of men and women as far as kind of how long they stay. I think there are a lot of people who stay and a lot of people who leave.
In the back.
About women in the CIA. Now, the CIA needs information. I mean, that's one of the things they value and require, right? And to get the information, over the years, I would think they would need women to impersonate or to sort of insinuate or somehow be part of the gathering of information. So I don't really understand why. Were they freelancers or whatever? What would you call them? And why were they not embraced within the agency kind of? Or you think they would have been embraced earlier than other forms of government?
I think in the field, I think they had plenty of female agents who were the locals, that maybe they were assets, yes. And just as employees running these people would have been less. But all of the biggest risk takers a lot of times were locals in these places, in Eastern Europe in particular, and all of those zones. So I'm sure they had plenty of female assets out there running between them, but
You might explain the difference between an asset and
between an asset and
a case officer.
Oh, a case officer would be your CIA person who would maybe meet the asset at a safe house, and the asset would be out there in the general population. They might work in a factory or they might be a telegraph operator at a police station or a translator. They might work for somebody important. They would be somebody who would be willing to give information to a case officer who would be running them and would cultivate this relationship. Sometimes these relationships could be cultivated without the asset even knowing this person worked for the CIA. If the case officer was particularly good, they would just relationships like that. But I think it's a fair question. I mean, why wouldn't you have more women case officers and better equipped to establish those type of relationships? But anyway.
So I retired from CIA after an undisclosed number of years. My wife says I was a caseworker there, but I can neither confirm nor deny that. Now I'm a fellow scribbler. I'd love to hear from all panel members on their daily writing habits and where they go to research their ideas.
So I guess I don't really have sort of a set schedule. When I wrote Need to Know, I was actually on an extended maternity leave with my younger son. So it was sort of fitting in writing around nap times in preschool and that sort of thing. So no routine really for me, just kind of trying to do it when I can.
Did you by any chance belong to Invisible Ink? Yeah, I got called back to speak to Invisible Ink, I think in 2002, which was just fascinating to me. It's the internal agency writers group, and I loved the fact that it existed because when I was doing this 10 years earlier, before that, I felt like I was, out there on my own, and I probably wasn't. I'm sure that just as the legal profession has. Every second person is writing a courtroom drama, and reporters are notorious for always having a book. And, I'm sure it's immensely appealing to half the people in the agency to spin this stuff into stories. So I commend you for doing it. My routine is dependent on whether I am on deadline or not. So I have a book due, for example, in January, and I have a book coming out in January. I haven't started the book due in January yet because it's a series book. And series books for me are faster to write than standalones. When I write a standalone, I am starting with the tabula rasa, and I have to do original research. I have to generally research a lot of ancillary things that are important details to time and place. I tend to write historical fiction a great deal. I do have some contemporary books, but my two most recent espionage novels are World War II novels, actually my three most recent. And there's so much detail that is important for atmosphere and authenticity that has to be done, that the research is very demanding, I find, and it's part of what I love, and the reason I write is to do the research. But those books generally require 4 times as much time as a series novel. So when I am really working, but I personally don't believe any of us has more than 4 to 6 hours of good working time in us, and that most professions demand that we show up for 8 to 12, and that's ludicrous. And the great gift of a writing career is that you can put in the 4 to 6 hours that are meaningful substantively, and then go have your life. So I would say that's pretty much my routine. I also came out of writing while I had kids around school schedules and nap times and things like that early on. My kids are now 20 and 24, so that's definitely changed. But I would tend to write from 10 to 2. You know, you get them to school, you sit down, you do the work, you transition to go pick them up, that kind of thing. So it was that middle block of time that I've always used.
My most difficult writing habits, or squeezed ones, were my first 3 books when I was still a journalist. I was overseas in Berlin while I was writing my first one, which was set in the Balkans, and that tended to be written on weekends or in evenings or on Friday afternoons. After I'd turn in my weekend story, I would go to some cafe on Kantstrasse and write there while they let you do whatever you want for 4 hours. But if you're going to bring up work habits, I can't let this opportunity pass without mentioning there was a New York Times profile of the wonderful Ann Tyler last Friday. She doesn't give many interviews. And I just have to mention this because she's a beautiful writer, but she mentioned how she physically writes her book, and it was the most bizarre sequence I've ever seen. Look it up when you get home so you can get it exactly right. But basically, she writes everything out in longhand. And then when she's satisfied with that, she takes it and types it out, and then she brings it back and then corrects it and then writes it in longhand again and then reads it into a dictaphone.
Oh, God.
And I remember reading this thinking, like, that is just amazing. And the most interesting part to me was reading it into the dictaphone, because she has so much, well, I don't know, but it's so interesting that she was doing it with her voice, because it changes everything. You're hearing the rhythms much better, the dialogue in particular, and her dialogue is so important to her books with all these family interactions. And I find that when I'm reading books aloud, I have made editing changes while doing readings, and people who are following along going, I noticed you dropped that sentence in there. Because it does change things. So anyway, I just had to mention that because it was so strange. And if we're going to talk about writing habits, that was the strangest one I've seen recently.
Well, on top of that, Dan Tyler's editor will sometimes just say, no, not this one. Put it in a drawer and start a new one.
Oh, really? Okay. Well, that didn't come up. But
Wait,
more
wait,
questions.
wait. I was going to ask you something, if you don't mind.
Oh, no, go ahead.
Do you mind? I'm curious whether your experience as a journalist, do you think, affects how you compose your fiction? Because I found, I had worked briefly at the Miami Herald and the San Jose Mercury News, and composing in a newsroom with noise all around you on deadline makes you adept, I think, at getting words on paper under any circumstance.
Yeah.
So I can't see you handwriting or dictaphoning anything. I mean, I find that my brain absorbs prose differently when I see it in print, simply. I mean, the print aspect is so important for me. I read print differently than I would read something handwritten.
Yeah. Well, I write, my main rule is always have a notebook nearby, because even if I'm not at my terminal writing, I will do a lot of scene work sometimes on legal pads and whatnot. And that goes with reporting too, because when you were out on stories where you needed to be filing on deadlines, whether it was covering a trial or whether it was covering something in a war zone, you were doing all your note-taking in longhand, and you were scribbling in long car rides and whatnot. You were sketching out your lead. So you had to become very adept at kind of thinking on the fly and scribbling out things in notebooks too. What's terrible is when I'll have a limited amount of paper in front of me. I'll be out at lunch, or I'll be somewhere where something will occur to me, and I'll start writing it down in the lower right corner, maybe on a printout page, even from a manuscript, and I run out of room. So I loop up to the top of the page, I draw a long arrow, and I write up in there, and then I turn the page over, and what I have to do before I get home is start numbering all these things so I'll know what the order was. So I get back to my computer, and I've got like numbers 1 through 19 on like 6 different pages, and I'm piecing it all together. But it's just a weird habit of a sort of a journalist out in the field. And there was first back there.
I had to laugh when, Dan, you just said when you get back to your terminal, talking about, that's a computer, and you're talking about dictaphones, and so the question is, also, your book is set in 1979, and you just mentioned that your last 2 books were set during the World War II. I'm afraid I don't know when Need to Know is set, but do you find the current environment ripe for novels, and who's doing the mentoring to the future writers of the current state of affairs in the same regard that you're currently writing from your experiences?
Wait, I'm sorry, clarify, what's that, the mentoring for what?
So you were talking also about being mentors earlier in this conversation, and so you both got a technology thing, a current affairs question, and maybe tomorrow's novel won't be written as print, and I agree with you also how much I react to seeing print, but so what's the future of your genre? What's the future of who's writing today's novels?
I'll just take the first part of that, and then we'll switch on. As far as writing about what's going on right now, especially in this town, when I was looking at the book I'm working on is set in 1979 and 2014. I started writing it in 2015, but as it progressed and it started getting into the election year, I realized quite happily that there was no way I wanted to set it forward because it was too unpredictable. I knew that if a certain person got elected, it would just be, you couldn't make stuff up that would top that. So I pity people who, I think that's why, forget Kevin Spacey's indiscretions, I think that show was doomed the minute Trump took office, because you can't make up stuff Machiavellian and chaotic enough to match present day. I pity anyone trying to write political fiction set in contemporary times. So,
well, it has affected television profoundly, yes. A friend of mine, Stephen White, and I have been working on a television series together. He's a thriller writer. And it was set in Calvin Coolidge's White House during the Prohibition era. And we have been told, basically, nothing White House-centered is selling in Hollywood. It's just too impossible to touch right now. And this was an historical, so I mean, that was fascinating to me. But as far as writing going forward, it's interesting. Sometimes in difficult eras, people do look to the past. So there's a certain fascination, I think, with Safe Houses, in that it looks at the Cold War from a different angle. I loved that aspect of it. I mean, your sense of Berlin is so acute from years of having lived there that it just ripples off the page, and that's what's, for me, one of the more satisfying aspects of the novel. And And I do think people love to read World War II stories because the certainties then of NATO, of the transatlantic partnership were profound, and they're comforting when we look forward to next week. So, there's an aspect of retreat there and perhaps escapism, but I do think you see more historical espionage coming to the fore.
Will you be writing contemporary in your next book? Or?
Yeah, I think I'm going to stick to contemporary. And, with Need to Know, I don't think I was really I think maybe since I had sort of just been at the agency and everything, and when you're there, you really don't think about politics as much. I know that sounds strange, but we're trained so much to kind of just, our job is to kind of try to figure out the truth, present that to policymakers, and hope they're doing the right thing with it. And, I think as much as you can, you try to kind of not really pay attention to what's going on. And I know that's getting harder and harder to do, but, I think in Need to Know, I just sort of tried to stay away from kind of what's going on at the top and just focus on kind of more the personal level and the family level. And I think maybe that could help kind of going forward.
I'm sorry, in the middle, a second from you.
Well, thank you all for coming, first of all, I'd just like to say. So I think you both have touched on, at least my interpretation is that gender equality, you've seen improvements that the agency has made over the years. So I'm just wondering, in each of your respective tenures, I'm wondering if you all could speak a little bit to what major weaknesses you saw in the agency, whether it's at an organizational level, whether it was at an operational level, somewhat of a gap or a need that you may have experienced. And then again, I don't know to what extent you can speak to this, but if you've seen improvements in that realm, if you think that there are still gaps that exist and needs that have not yet been met.
My experience really was sort of overall very positive, and I think that does speak to the fact that there have been a lot of improvements overall over the years. I think I really did sort of experience kind of more issues with equality sort of in other parts of the government. And so I think maybe, I don't know, I'm trying to think of an example specific to the CIA where there still needs to be work. And on the analytics side, I think they're really just, it's a good place to work as a woman right now. And the people out in the field and for people in the operational side, I think maybe there's more work to be done there. And I think that's not all the CIA's fault either. I think, a lot of sort of being on that side of things is moving around, talking to people, in other countries, befriending people. And I think as a woman in much of the world, that's harder to do. So I think there is sort of an inherent obstacle that women need to overcome, and that's not necessarily the CIA's fault, but that there maybe is an obstacle there.
I don't have any observations about inadequacies during the period I was there, and I was there briefly enough that I would feel wrong in suggesting that. I do think there's a cyclical issue that plagues intelligence in general, no matter what country you're in, and that is the relationship with the executive branch, which intelligence is designed to serve. And so, for example, I came in right after Ronald Reagan had been in power and had made the director of Central Intelligence a cabinet post, which meant it was actually in the room in cabinet meetings, and it was in policy discussions, which it's not intended to do. It's supposed to serve policy, not make it. And that was a difficult blurring of lines for the CIA, I think, during his tenure. And when George Bush came in, he, having been a director of Central Intelligence, immediately reversed that. And I think that was a course correction that affected the atmosphere of the place when I was hired. It was very focused on ground truth that was not political. And that's an ideal for the agency at its best. When it is politicized from either direction for any reason, people get uncomfortable. A lot of people will start quitting because they feel that they're being pressured to produce analysis that isn't fitting the facts. And so sometimes during those periods you lose really great institutional knowledge as people flee. I think that's happening at state now, to the detriment of everybody. But that's just my comment. I think it is buffeted by political tides that it cannot control at times.
And you had another question up here.
Thank you. Melissa Maley's on the board here, isn't she? Yeah. You probably know who Melissa Maley. Well, anyway, she's written several books, and I thought it was very cool that she also has written books for middle school kids. And I was wondering if any of you have thought about writing in that genre for up and rising students who might be interested in a career one day.
Anything that would require me to contemplate middle school again in any way would be a revisiting of such misery as I wouldn't be capable. But I think it is admirable to write to that audience. It's the most confused, I think, audience in the world.
We do a really great workshop with that age group, a spy fiction writers workshop that Melissa works with us on. So they can write for themselves.
I think all middle schoolers are spies anyway. They're all operating
well,
undercover.
their parents are.
They're all undercover. So.